The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden of the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, there is this lovely tradition that the Chinese have in Africa that goes back actually quite a long time. I don't know exactly how far, but the first visit of the year by the foreign minister customarily always begins in Africa. Every week it's usually every year for about a week, maybe 4 or 5 countries are on his agenda. And it always starts the year that way. And I always thought that was such a pleasant tradition. And despite all of the other demands on Wang Yi's time, the foreign minister of China, Africa is always there. And so it really reveals an importance about the trips that the Chinese take and how the Chinese value the face-to-face relationships. And it strikes such a dramatic contrast with how the United States and European countries see these visits. And it's not only high-level party visits from the likes of Wang Yi and Xi Jinping, but what is so interesting is how many provincial leaders go and how many at the administrative level are going. These visits are happening so often and at so many different levels that are really beyond the headlines. It's just absolutely fascinating. So I'm just curious to get your take on it, whether or not you think that these visits, the symbolism of them, matter, or is that just a talking point from the point of view of the Chinese?
I think they matter, and the way that Wang Yi's visit to Africa this year contrasted with the American position made it very clear. So basically the same week that Donald Trump got the whole of Africa angry with kind of insulting comments, Wang Yi was in Africa, busy touring from country to country, to 4 countries in total. And it just highlighted not only the difference in tone between the two, but also the fact that China favors this kind of, person-to-person handshaking, red carpet kind of meeting. And I think it has a lot of power in Africa. The visits of African dignitaries to Beijing is at the same time that the spectacle of the African dignitary being actually received by China in Beijing, it carries a certain symbolic weight. And it's very interesting for me the role that one-on-one visits actually play in China-Africa relations.
So where African leaders go may actually shed some light on their foreign policy, on Chinese priorities in Africa, or it may not actually. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We've got this fantastic infographic that was produced by Development Reimagined, and it's really the first of its kind. I haven't seen this in 8 years of doing China-Africa reporting. I've never seen an infographic data point that actually points to where the visits are that correlate to foreign policy. And that's what's come out this past week. We posted it on our LinkedIn profile on our page there, and it received over 50,000 views. It's a topic that lots of people are discussing. And one of the authors of it is the CEO of Development Reimagined, Hannah Ryder, who's an old friend of our show, who joins us on the line once again from Beijing, China. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you very much, Eric and Cobus. It's wonderful to be with you today.
Well, congratulations on the infographic. And by the way, one little side note about Development Reimagined that I just learned. You are the first Kenyan wholly foreign-owned enterprise in China. That is really just a neat little factoid about you guys.
Yes, that's right. Most of the African companies that operate here in China are usually joint ventures. But we decided that it would be the right thing to actually go through the process of being a wholly foreign-owned enterprise, and we've made it. There are a few others from other countries in Africa, but not so many. So we're trying to set the trend now.
Oh, that's very cool. Well, part of what you do as an international development consultancy is to produce these types of insights that your infographic did. And the title of your infographic is Who does China prioritize? And the visits tell us something about that. Let me give a couple headlines before we get into kind of some of the details of what you did with this infographic. 79 visits to 43 different African countries over the past 10 years. Now, that sounds like a lot, but I guess the key question is, what does this reveal about China's priorities in Africa, about where these visits actually happened?
Yes, well, this was exactly what we wanted to explore. And when we started off looking for the data, we really had no idea. We had this idea, in the past, there have been media stereotypes that, China prioritizes visiting corrupt countries, or maybe they'd be visiting the countries where they've got the most investment, or a whole set of a range of different possibilities. And we found that none of those are necessarily the right explanations, nor is an explanation that China just visits the poorest countries. We found in particular that South Africa was the top visited country overall, which really makes sense because in the past it has been the most dynamic economy in the continent, and it also hosted the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit back in 2015, the last one. But beyond that, there were some other countries which kind of didn't make so much sense, or we hadn't expected to come out. Chad, for example, it's typically known as a fragile state. It had 3 visits out of the 79. Namibia was another. It's next to Angola, and Angola is the country that has the most loans from China in the continent, but it wasn't Angola that got the visits. It was Namibia, and Namibia doesn't typically feature in Chinese. When we talk about the countries that China engages with, we don't usually talk about Namibia or Chad so much. So it really showed us that doing this kind of investigation is in a way useful, because we can get behind the headlines to really get a. We really need to have a stronger understanding of how China interacts with African countries, and doing these kinds of investigations can really help us get a bit more of a picture as to what kind of strategy it has, and then for African countries themselves to align their strategy and take that into account in their strategies working with China.
Can you talk us through how the survey was done? Like, how did you gather the data? And also, who is counted as a high-level visitor? What kinds of visits were included and which were excluded?
Yes, very good point. So let me start with your second question. Your second question was about the high-level visits. We looked at the visits which had been done by the Chinese president, the Chinese premier or prime minister in other words, and also the foreign minister. So those were the only 3 top leadership that we looked at. Of course, there have been many other visits from China's senior leadership and other senior officials and so on, including top members of the CPC. But we just wanted to keep it fairly simple, and so that was who we went with. And in fact, even just with those 3 positions, we found they'd made 79 visits, which is really quite astounding.
The CPC, of course, referring to the Communist Party of China.
Of course, yes, sorry. Also, we only looked at the last 10 years. These visits, especially the annual visit from the foreign minister, have been ongoing from well before then. Certainly from 2003, there is some data. But because our methodology, so I'm coming to your first question, our methodology was to look through media reports in all possible languages, through Chinese, English, French, a little bit of Spanish and Portuguese spoken on the continent. So we looked for those types of media reports, and that was how we gathered the data. So we, again, the reason why we kept it to that level of leadership was also because we expected those type of visits to receive information, to have information provided through the media, especially on Chinese outlets. And also, we kept it 10 years for that reason as well.
So 79 visits, 43 countries over 10 years. That seems like a lot, but let's get some context here. How does that compare to, say, the French, the British, or the Americans, or anybody else? What's the context for that?
Good question as well. Well, actually, I haven't put down. We haven't calculated the numbers for the US, but I think it's quite telling. For example, Theresa May was recently in China, and there was an article just the other day about the UK global engagement. A prime minister has not stepped on African soil since 2013, a UK prime minister. So, of course, yes, other countries, I think French leadership have been to Africa quite recently, also Merkel too. But there are some big gaps, and even the US has Obama went to Africa. He visited 3 countries in 2015, I believe. But it's that kind of record. It's nowhere near consistent every year for the leadership to do so for other countries. Even African countries themselves, even African leaders themselves, of course they will visit other African countries, but they certainly don't have the resources to make this kind of regular visit across so many countries each year. I mean, it's on average over seven visits per year, so it's quite a bit.
One of the interesting points the study makes is that there's a lot of perceptions that China tends to favor East Africa over West Africa. There's been some data showing that China tends to have more traction or more involvement with East Africa, among others, because of the kind of French sphere of influence in West Africa. But your study shows that despite the East Africa being an official node on the Belt and Road route, there actually isn't that much difference between East and West Africa in terms of the visits.
Yeah, no, and this was also quite interesting. Again, it was Southern Africa, particularly because of the dominance of South Africa in China's foreign policy so far, that has received the majority of visits. And Eastern and Western Africa are fairly similar, and also Central Africa too. Northern Africa seemed to be the least visited region, but on the other hand, though Northern Africa has a lot fewer countries in any case. So it was quite interesting to look at this perspective, because, as you say, especially going forwards, and one of the interesting questions will be: will the focus of the Chinese leadership change as a result of the Belt and Road Initiative, and will the Eastern region get more attention from the Chinese leadership? My inkling is probably not. I think from the way that the Chinese leadership seem to have approached visiting the African countries, it seems to be that they are trying to find a fairly neutral distribution of who they visit, and they really plan it quite carefully to make sure that they're not particularly favouring one region or the other.
Support for this podcast comes from the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University School of Journalism in Johannesburg. The ACRP provides reporting grants, workshops, and other professional development opportunities for both African and Chinese journalists. Follow the ACRP on Twitter at Wits China Africa, or visit africachinareporting.co.za for information about grants and upcoming seminars.
Today I posted on LinkedIn a graphic that showed that China's imports of Zambian iron ore peaked in about 2013, 2014, and it's been just a sharp line down since then. And that graph, in so many ways, highlights the changing China-Africa relationship over the past 3 or 4 years. There's data that came out of Barry Saltman in Hong Kong, who's a professor there, and he did some research showing that the peak of Chinese immigration to Africa was somewhere around 2013, 2014. Trade has been down since that time. It looks like there might be some slowing in investment as Belt and Road now draws away more investment towards those other countries and away from Africa. And there's this general sense that Africa is a little bit too risky now in the portfolio in some parts, and there's a consolidation of the investment to some of the more stable parts of Africa. So my point here is that the China-Africa relationship, it looks like in 2018, may undergo some very profound changes, that it moves from a purely economic resource extraction type of relationship into more of a diplomatic, maybe a security, post-conflict resolution, lots of different things. What do you think the visits can tell us about the direction that China-Africa relations has been going since maybe 2013, 2014, and where we might see this going in the future?
Well, I think what the visits tell us is, in a sense, that we need to start looking at this question in even more detail. I believe that 2018, I do think, I agree with you, Eric, that it is going to be a very important and pivotal year for China-Africa relations, not only because of the Belt and Road Initiative and in a sense the increasing competition with other regions, but also because it is the year of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which will be held in September this year in Beijing. Now, FOCAC has been going on since the year 2000. This year, it effectively turns 18. And yet, at the same time, there is very little understanding on the continent and outside of what this relationship really constitutes and what it means. Partly that's a problem from the Chinese side. Chinese side doesn't issue infographics like this, for example, which would be wonderful if they did, right? But it's kind of organizations like mine or the Johns Hopkins University who put together data as a public good for people to be able to understand what the China relationship looks like with the African continent. So I think that it does, that the relationship will change, in a sense, out of necessity, but also because hopefully there will be an increasing awareness from the African side of what they want and how they can shape the relationship, whether it's through visits or whether through other types of demands on China itself. Of course, what we didn't do with the infographic is cover, well, the other side, which African leaders have visited China. But that tells you a very different story, and it tells you more about something about the resources within the African continent, and also about how, I did a recent article about Kenya's relationship and Zimbabwe's relationship with China. And, Mugabe, for example, visited China a really large, significant number of times, I believe over 13 times over his tenure, whereas the Kenyan state visits have been significantly less. That tells you a totally different story, but I think we also need to understand better about how China views the continent. And at the moment, I believe that we don't have enough insight into that. And what I hope to do with my team at Development Reimagined is try to bring out more and more of this kind of information, objective, factual information that people can digest and use in trying to think about what next for the China-Africa relationship.
And looking at all of this data, all of these visits, this is a very basic question, but could you get a stronger idea of what the Chinese try to achieve with these visits? Because as you point out, they don't necessarily correlate to where their biggest investment is, or who has the most loans from China, or where natural resources are necessarily. They're very kind of dotted all over the continent in a more complicated pattern. So did you get a sense of what is actually achieved, or what are the actual goals of using these visits as a tool rather than, say, more leadership summits or kind of any other kind of tool of diplomacy?
Well, take the last set of visits that Foreign Minister Wang Yi went on, that was a set of visits, and this is why you also have to distinguish visits to how many countries, because while Wang Yi went to 4 African countries, and in each of those he didn't spend a great deal of time there. So he really just saw the top leadership in those countries. And of course, if you just got 1 or 2 short visits, one or two short meetings, then the country really does have to prioritize exactly what it's going to be trying to achieve with that meeting. And of course, again, the type of engagement from the foreign minister is going to be completely different from the type of engagement with a presidential visit, for example. So there is also that distinction, which we didn't bring out in the infographic. But on the other hand, to date, again, the way that China's top leadership have engaged with African leadership has been very much on a government-to-government level. In my view, I believe that's also why the visits are not necessarily correlated with the largest investments and so on. Only in some cases, and especially when the African leaders visit China, are there more kind of investment opportunities and so on. There's more time to discuss those. But when the Chinese leadership goes over, it's much more about very kind of much more top level issues, security, any types of risks, key politics in the region, etc., and overarching issues like, are you going to be supporting the Belt and Road Initiative? This is what we need from you. And this is what we can offer if you do support it. So those I think are the key. Is why we see this kind of fairly broad distribution across the continent and not such a concentrated one. Because it seems that China's strategy is much more to try to go to a full range of countries in the continent.
When you first told me that you were putting together this infographic. I really wasn't expecting that much, to be honest with you, because my assumption was that, I've got this figured out. The Chinese go where the money is, because that's kind of what we assume in Africa. We assume that the leadership is following where the investments are. So South Africa being the most visited makes sense. That's where there's a high concentration of Chinese assets. Zambia would also make sense. Lots of iron ore investments. But what surprised me about this, and this is why I love China-Africa studies, is that nothing is as it seems. And when you pointed out that 26 of the 33 African countries that are classified as the least developed that the leadership has been to, and yet countries like South Sudan, where the Chinese have an enormous political, diplomatic, and economic stake with the conflict there, they really haven't visited. That was confounding as well. And so once again, we are confronted.
That was a shock to me.
That was a shock. I mean, it wasn't a surprise to me that you said that the 2 countries that still recognize Taiwan, that, you know what, they ain't going there.
Of course.
We kind of assume that.
Yeah.
But in so many other areas of the data that you revealed, it was surprising. And again, this is where Cobus and I have these discussions with people who think they've got the China-Africa relationship figured out. China's here to do X, they're here to do Y, there you go. And yet here we have another data point which really confounds people as to what they're doing and why they're doing it. And I guess for the final kind of reflection, what surprised you the most when you kind of put the final touches on your infographic and you look and you step back from it all? What was the takeaway that you said, wow, didn't see that one coming?
Oh, there's so many, Eric, and 2 of them you've just talked about yourself. The one about the poorest countries in the world, I think, was an important one for me, actually. And as a consultancy which is focused on poverty reduction, that is important. The idea that China it always says that it's prioritizing the poorest countries, but the idea that it is prioritizing the leadership of the poorest countries, that was really quite, that felt to be significant and positive, positive for the Chinese leadership. And the kind of example in a way that they're setting for others. But yeah, there were quite a few surprises. I really did expect the visits to be more concentrated, I have to admit. And South Sudan was definitely a surprise. Libya too, actually, in some ways. My hope is that there's just a few remaining countries that would like visits. I imagine that would be South Sudan. Lesotho, actually also has quite a lot of Chinese investment, especially from the private sector, and then some of the islands, Comoros and so on. Despite the fact that China has done one of its most important aid projects and significant aid projects in terms of malaria reduction in Comoros, the leadership hasn't been there. So these could be some interesting places for the leadership to head in the next few years.
Who does China prioritize? It's a fascinating infographic that you can find over at developmentreimagined.com. That's developmentreimagined.com. It was put together by Hannah Ryder and her team there, which is this international development consultancy. Brand new. You're only, a few months old now, or?
Yes, just a few months old. So, we're gathering steam.
Exciting times. So if people want to check out this infographic, you can either head over to my LinkedIn page or check out Development Reimagined. This is going to be the first of what we hope will be a number of these infographics, because it is absolutely fascinating to see this data point. Hannah, if people want to follow the work that you're doing at Development Reimagined, how can they stay in touch with you?
Yeah, they can stay in touch with me personally on Twitter, WeChat, and or using @HMRyder. And they can also follow our Development Reimagined Twitter site, which is Twitter handle, which is DevReimagined, @DevReimagined.
I highly recommend it. Hannah is posting a lot of great content there. I follow her very closely on Twitter, and so she's an invaluable resource in the China-Africa space. And just one little shout out that you and I are both on the advisory board now of the China-Africa Technology Initiative, I think it is, CATI, with Stephanie Zhu. And so just give a little shout out there. So that's really exciting. Some really lots of new and cool things that are happening in the China-Africa space, Development Reimagined, and the China-Africa Technology Initiative. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us from Beijing. Congratulations on both the getting Development Reimagined off the ground and your first infographic out.
Thank you so much. Great to speak to you, Eric and Cobus.
Cobus, we often talk about how the Chinese are playing by a different set of rules. And that may be in some cases in a political context where they're building the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank to rival the World Bank, or they are building the Belt and Road as a way to facilitate trade that is to their advantage. But there's another part of this that I think Hannah's research revealed, which is this highly personal form of diplomacy and politics. And it's a way that is very, very unfamiliar to Americans and to Europeans, in my view. This is my take. That we as Westerners have relied on the institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, to help promote our foreign policy. The Chinese have not had that luxury to be able to do that. So they have instead really created these very deep personal relationships with people like Robert Mugabe, with people like even Jacob Zuma and some other African leaders. And it's a highly personal thing. And I think in so many ways these visits represents a different way of conducting diplomacy that is largely unfamiliar to Americans. There's a saying in Chinese, 关系很重要, relationships are important. And really, you cannot overstate how much this matters to the Chinese, this highly personal form of politics. And I think it's unfamiliar to the West. I think it's very, very familiar to Africans and to South Asians and Middle Easterners and Latin Americans. But it's a different way of doing politics in international diplomacy.
I agree. I think it's very important for everyone to look at the way that China does what it does. It's very important to look at the kind of rituals, the patterns that emerge from Chinese practices over a long time, because one of the key moments in China-Africa relationship is in 1963 when then Premier Zhou Enlai went on this massive African tour, like country by country by country. It went on for a long time and just made all of these alliances. And since then, there has been the use of visits and actually meeting in person has been this important tool for the Chinese, even as they themselves have gone through massive massive, crazy, radical changes, from one system to the other and so on. So I think it's really important to see what endures and what, which patterns keep repeating in the China-Africa relationship, because that, I think, reveals a lot about the nature of the relationship itself.
But look at how they have managed some of the personal relationships over the past 10 years. Take Michael Sata, the late president and opposition leader in Zambia, who for so much of his later part of his career defined himself as the ultimate opponent of China. And then when he became president, the Chinese very deftly handled him and turned him into one of really Africa's biggest supporters of China. How they stood by Robert Mugabe when the rest of the world turned their backs on him, on Mugabe, and really worked hard to isolate him. The Chinese were very, very loyal right till the end. And part of it is politics. Part of it is diplomacy. Part of it is standing up to the West. Sure, that's all there. But there's another part of it that I think is an intangible. It's personal. Relationships matter. And they've done that. I mean, you look at what they did in Zimbabwe, because for a long time we thought, you know what, they're so tight with Mugabe that when he goes down, the Chinese relationship in Zimbabwe is going to go down with him. And lo and behold, they've come up winners on that one, aces, with the new administration. And I think a lot of that has to do with these personal relationships. That just cannot be understated. And it is a hard thing for people to understand, that going back and having FaceTime with people and exchanging gifts and studying each other's countries and really paying attention and studying the languages, which the Chinese are doing better now. And I'm not saying this to flatter the Chinese. I'm more impressed by their introducing a different way at a level of diplomacy that we are generally not accustomed to seeing. And that's the part that I think is interesting. Final thoughts from you, Cobus.
I think it's also really important not to underestimate how badly Africa is frequently treated, and how much I think Africa, it's difficult how to put it, but I think there is a kind of a preoccupation in Africa with just insults, frequently from the West, and not even particularly directed insults, but just kind of slightly shabby treatment, or just being very clear that you are not on anyone's list of priorities. The impossibility of getting a one-on-one, 10 minutes with a Secretary of State, for example, the way that African leaders are always met in groups. And so, so something like the recent, like Donald Trump's recent comments, I mean, that just went ballistic in Africa. The amount of press it got was crazy. So, and I mean, especially considering, how many crazy things Donald Trump says, that one really landed. It really made people very angry. And so, understandably.
And it's prompted a visit. And it's prompted a visit from Rex Tillerson,
exactly.
Who Donald Trump said to help repair the relationship, he's going to deploy his Secretary of State. So in this case, I think the Americans also value some kind of FaceTime in Africa.
Yeah, no, exactly. But the kind of the repeated ritual and the one-on-one meeting and the rolling out of the entire pageantry, all of that stuff, it really counts. For a continent that doesn't get that kind of treatment elsewhere, and I think one can't underestimate that.
So what do you think? Do these visits matter? Is it just window dressing? Is it just diplomacy? Is it just politics as usual? Or is there something more substantive there? Take a look at the infographic. We would love to hear what you think about my position, Cobus's position. We have a great discussion going on all of our social media platforms. This is also a topic that we raise every week in our email newsletter that goes out on Mondays. If you haven't signed up for it, please do go over to ChinaAfricaProject.com, or you can find it on our Facebook page at facebook.com/China Africa Project. Also, one other key thing, if you're a listener of this podcast and you get it from Apple Podcasts, but you are a big listener of Spotify, we're now on Spotify. And so you can listen to us there. And Cobus, 10% now of our downloads are coming from YouTube. So you can find us every week on YouTube as well. So YouTube, Spotify, of course, Apple Podcasts, those are the main place to listen. But we would love to have you join, share, and rate us. Rating us also helps just because, well, they tell us it helps us move up in the hierarchy and so that more people can see us and hopefully experience the show. So we would be so grateful for the feedback. We'll be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. For Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadinsky or Eric at eOlander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.ChinaAfricaProject.com.